Gower Street is laid out in the 1780s or so and becomes an area for professional, commercial, well-to-do, dissenting, free-thinking individuals.
Bentham was very much the intellectual inspiration for the University of London, which, after its foundation in 1826, soon became University College London. So there was always a radical, critical edge to his thinking. The principle of utility, which was his critical standard, you applied to all actions and institutions, and so he used it to think about sexual morality. He argued that there was no reason to persecute, punish people for engaging in sexual activity insofar as it did not cause any harm.
Molly houses were sites of queer life and queer joy. At the time, there would have been about 200 around London.
The area between Lincoln's Inn Fields and the Strand, just east of Covent Garden, has always been a little hodgepodge of wealth, entertainment, and a bit of down at heel in St Clement's Dane, and a bit of sleaze. Narrow streets, a lot of buildings that would have been the same since just after the Great Fire of London. And around here in 1810, there's a pub called the White Swan, somewhere pretty near here, where the Vere Street coterie are found.
Now, what happened inside Molly houses? On the one hand, in the historical record, what we have are often the gazes of mocking outsiders. But I think it's really important when considering queer and trans history that it's not just about what sources exist, but how we read them. And so what do we find when we read against the grain of these documents? Queer joy. So for instance, there were marriage ceremonies, birth ceremonies that outside sources referred to as parodies, but we could also understand them as rituals of community building and belonging. Perhaps imagining and creating and performing queer and trans families. We have all these records of the fabulous gowns, the ribbons that they wore, and again, the sort of joy and camaraderie that they managed to bring together in these spaces. In the space of the Molly House, there were many men who went by women's names in ways that we might consider to be trans feminine today. They went by all these nicknames like the Russian Bear, sort of signifying the way that in the space of the Molly House is a space of play and of imagination for queer people. People adopted new identities. For instance, 16-year-old Thomas White went by Black-Eyed Leonora. A place like the Molly House was an exciting place to be. Finding new companions, new community, new ways of living life. Thomas White was really popular, and really popular specifically among the elites who frequented the Molly House. And engaging in sex work at the time might seem like exploitation, but at the same time, it also was a means of perhaps accessing other resources they wouldn't have otherwise. And we could sort of imagine something happening similar for whites, that this became an outlet and a refuge and a place of work at the same time.
And Bentham's overall view was that there should be sexual liberty, subject to consent. He argued that there should be no criminal penalties for men engaging in same-sex activities.
But Bentham was a minority. And in 1810 instead, the law said that sodomy was a criminal offense.
English society was dominated by the Church of England and by the aristocracy, and it was their morality which the state enforced. The traditional view was that sex should only take place between one man and one woman who were married to each other and for the purpose of producing children.
But precisely because molly houses were sites of queer joy meant that they were also targets. Targets for a state that could not tolerate queer joy. Fast forward to the summer of 1810. The police infiltrated the Vere Street coterie, observing what they saw as sexual aberrations, monstrous activities of the sodomites, and then eventually formally raiding them.
They were brought from Newgate, down Fleet Street, all along the Strand, into what's now Trafalgar Square, but through the old Charing Cross, up to Haymarket. This is the entrance to what was St James's Market, where the offal and the waste and the stuff, cats, dogs, were to be thrown at them by a huge crowd. Everything we know about a late 18th, early 19th century crowd is that they are an incredibly powerful force. It's a moral force, and the crowd is probably taking out their horror at what they see in a very new sense as the unnaturalness of what the Vere Street coterie have done. A pillorying with a big crowd like this could go on for hours. Everybody's outside, there's huge energy, hate, disgust, horror, and a very physical threat from the crowd. It's like being in the stocks, but you're upright, fixed, and you'll face out to the crowd, turning on a stand. They were all apparently together, feeling both the moral force and the very real physical force of the things that were coming at them. Pillorying was a public shaming.
But here's the irony, that those who saw themselves as normal, who saw themselves as righteous, were the ones doing monstrous things like buying dead cats to throw at those poor souls in the stocks. The stocks were bad, but what would happen to young 16-year-old Thomas White and his friend James Newborn Hepburn would be far worse. They were found guilty of sodomy. So the Vere Street scandal was particularly sparked by the fear of this type of sexual impropriety happening among the guards. That some of the young men who were part of the army were actually part of the molly house scene, that instead of being, I guess, the strong specimens of English manhood and all their heterosexuality, were instead mollies.
According to the Buggery Act, which had been passed in the 16th century, men were subject to the death penalty if they were found guilty of engaging in same-sex relationships.
So what happened to prisoners who were condemned to death, as Hepburn and White were, was that most sentences like that were commuted or pardoned. A criminal who had been condemned was merely branded or transported. So there was a chance that Hepburn and White could have been pardoned. And although they were sentenced on December the 5th, their fate wasn't known.
The Prince Regent at the time actually gave all the other convicts who were sentenced to death a conditional pardon.
To their horror, and that of many interested in what would happen to the Vere Street coterie, they weren't pardoned. And here, without any commutal pardon to their sentence, Thomas White, who's only just 17, and James Newbold Hepburn were hanged White's mother was watching.
He wasn't estranged from his family, as one might think. His mother was deeply affected by it, so much so that the newspapers report that she herself would pass away a few days later.
There is much that's ironic or paradoxical. Most of all that we are right beside St. Paul's and the churchyard here, where many of the original ideas about free thinking, the dissemination of education, democratic ideas to all, were seeded throughout the late 18th century and the couple of decades before. But right beside St. Paul's churchyard and right beside the free-thinking areas of the city, men were still hanged here.
Yet at the same time, when thinking about queer history, we cannot let tragedy overdetermine it. The fact is that joy did manage to flourish in these places, that although raids did happen, nonetheless, queer people managed to still regroup, build community, have new ways of building kinship, families, marriages, and thrive despite all the repressive regimes.
Bentham was worried in relation to his writings on homosexuality that if he published them, he would be prosecuted. I think one of Bentham's most valuable lessons is to say that whatever you might think about something is to ask, why do you think that? And just because you dislike a practice, you dislike the thought of men having sex with each other, doesn't mean to say it's wrong. The current publisher for Bentham's works is qUCL Press, the first fully open access university press in the United Kingdom. One of the principles behind the press is Bentham's dictum, the greatest happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number. Its publications have been downloaded 10 million times and reached readers in 242 countries and territories worldwide.
If you enjoyed this film, be sure to check out qUCL Press's brand new podcast series, The Greatest Good.